My name is Mary McCarty Arias, and I'll be your trainer for the next 2 hours. So what I'm going to ask first is that if people start to open up your chat, which you can go to the top of the slide, see where it says chat. If you would open that up now, and we'll be using it as we go along. And again, I'm glad that everybody is here. So just a couple of things before we start. This course is being sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean ATTC, the Addiction Technology and Transfer Center, and we are located at the New York State Psychiatric Institute up at Columbia. Yes, hi everybody. You can start to write in if you want to write in your name and where you're from while we're doing this beginning stuff. Feel free. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk about the New York State Psychiatric Institute is because there's a lot that goes on there, especially around marijuana, and I'll be talking about it as we go along. So there is something called the Cannabis Research Laboratory. I'm going to say I work there. I've been working at home for a year. I did not know that this existed, but it's run by a woman named Dr. Meg Haney, who I happen to know because we used to go to a meditation class that was held at Columbia. And I'm going to write this in the chat later on because she just did a podcast recently called The Blunt Truth About Weed. And it was really fascinating to hear what she had to say because they've been doing a lot of research. It's interesting too, and I'll just throw this out, is that when she does research, we always knew that they did animal research. We always used to look for the animals, but we couldn't find them. But she does people research, and she would have people come to her site at Columbia, and they would stay for a week inpatient. And there were people who were not patients, by the way, and she would give them marijuana and look at how it affected people. So I was thinking, gee, I didn't know that. So it might not be a good job to be in if you're in recovery, but it's interesting. So actually, we have people from other states as well, all beautiful states. So welcome to everybody who is here. Before I get started, let's just say that the ATTC that we work for, that I work for, covers all of New York, all of New Jersey, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. So some of the information will be New York and New Jersey specific, although as others of you can figure out, in the states that you're in, some of the laws may be different, and there's a lot that we don't know, and I'll tell you what I do know. For those of you who are in recovery, there will be some pictures of marijuana. So if it becomes a trigger for you, I'm just putting it out there that there will be some pictures. Also, SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, does not have any views on legalizing marijuana, so they're pretty clear about that. And as it says on the next page, this disclaimer that the development of these training materials was supported by a grant, and this is a number grant. Mike Chappell, who is the director of the Northeast and Caribbean ATTC, and it reflects actually our values, but as it says at the bottom, it does not necessarily represent the official views of SAMHSA. And SAMHSA is Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It's a federal agency that actually sponsors our program as well as many other programs. So if you've taken our courses before, I was going to go back and say the good thing about having webinars is that we can have people throughout the whole country. And the ATTC, the national network, by the way, probably has about 5 or 6 webinars going on today, and they're always free. At least I think they're free. And we offer credits, which I'll explain on the next couple of slides for those of you who are credentialing or recredentialing. This slide is used in, I think, almost every, actually in every training that we do, and it probably is in every training that the national ATTC does. And what they really want to be clear about is about language mattering, the power of words, and people first. And as we know, it's really helpful to look at the person with the disability. So the person who uses marijuana, the person who uses cocaine, the person who has bipolar disorder. And on a couple of levels, what it'll do is when you look at when you say it like that, and sometimes I remember people who say, why are you saying that? It's like too many words. Why can't I just say that addict over there? And as I'm saying that, by the way, you can hear my voice tone, which sounds very judgmental. But if you look at the person who is using a substance, it will help you become less judgmental. And as we actually become less judgmental, let's look at maybe how society can take away some of the stigma from substance use. So it's cool. We have people from all over. Welcome, everybody. There's my picture that I show every webinar, and I've been in the field for many years and have been doing training on substance use, mental health issues, HIV, and vocational rehabilitation. Some of you may have been in the course that I did the other day on vocational rehabilitation. And what vocational rehabilitation is that it is about helping people with disabilities get work or return to work. And for people with substance use as their disability, it's really helpful to be involved in work. It helps give people structure, gives people something to do, and gives people a paycheck, and that can be helpful as well. So what we're going to do today in this course is obviously to increase knowledge about marijuana use, and we'll look at some policy changes that may affect a client in treatment. It's almost like a marijuana 101. What we'll find is with some of the policies is that they are changing as we sit here. So I'll talk briefly. We have a couple of slides on the New York changes and the New Jersey changes. So again, if you're from Wyoming or other places, I won't have that information. We will talk about some of the states that have already approved recreational marijuana and some of the things they've had to look at. I hope I answered the question, Roberto, about the GIPRAs. All right, so as I said, we'll talk about kind of what we know today. And again, things have changed pretty quickly, and there's a lot that we don't know. So the objectives, and by the way, if you're in another state that doesn't have reciprocity, they always ask for goals and objectives. So when you do receive the copies of the slides, you'll have them as well. So what are the objectives of today? We'll start to describe the changes in New York and New Jersey state laws around recreational marijuana. Yeah, and thanks, Clyde. Clyde just wrote in the chat, by the way, is if he had inquiries around certificates in the past, he just wrote in Tree Chapel's email. Thanks, Clyde. So objectives, we'll talk about some of the changes. I just said that. We'll look at the mechanism of action of marijuana. So how does it affect the brain? And what's interesting too is that it affects the brain of an adolescent a lot differently than it does of an adult. And we'll talk about that. We'll look at the effects of marijuana on health and its potential use as a medicine. Many of you are in states that have approved medical marijuana, so that's different than recreational marijuana, and we'll talk about that as well. We'll look at what are some of the reasons why individuals with medical issues might use marijuana, and we'll look at some recent research on potential uses for marijuana. So that's what we're going to do till 2 o'clock. All right, let's look at couple of things, and actually there'll be 2 slides or a few slides around New York law. And the law was signed recently, and as of March 31st, that here's what you could have. So you could have the possession and use of up to 3 ounces is allowed by anyone over the age of 21. So you could have the possession, you could have now possess 3 ounces of marijuana and you would not get arrested. The law is 128 pages, and it may take more than a year to clarify some of those things. Some of you are in New Jersey know that. And actually, I have somebody from Illinois where believe it's also recreational marijuana has been approved. So it takes a while to kind of figure out how to set things up. But as of today, in New York, you can possess up to 3 ounces. Now, some of the laws will go for the regular public health law. So marijuana may be smoked wherever it is legal to smoke tobacco. So it doesn't include parks, restaurants, etc. I think at some point, I guess there are some restaurants that have smoking sessions, not or sections, not too many that I know of, but will things change? Yeah, probably. And it will change business probably as we know it. But as of today, uh, you still have to follow where you can smoke marijuana and where you can't. As I'm saying this, I'm thinking all you have to do sometimes is walk through a park, like Washington Square Park, and people are smoking marijuana. So even though it's against the public health law, people are still smoking. Oh yeah, actually, somebody just wrote in privately, but talking about the news that there was a Suffolk County police officer, and he was actually hit and killed by a woman who was smoking marijuana and also drinking. And actually, a lot of times when people get stopped for, let's say, by the police for I know that's another loaded question, but if they think that people, like in this case, she did say she had been drinking, but most people, when they get DWIs, they're often doing both. So, yeah, the parks, people, Washington Square Park, people have been smoking for a long time. On the podcast that I went on yesterday, which was just done the other day, one of the doctors was saying that he was walking around his neighborhood in Brooklyn, and he said this past week it seems like all of a sudden he can smell marijuana again. So during the pandemic he didn't, and people are smoking again on the street or wherever they are smoking. So I always say kind of take it with a grain of salt. I'll tell you what the research says or what the law says. What people do is a whole nother thing. But I think it's important to know what you can do and what you can't do. Now, some more information, and more information will come, but it's anticipated that there may be 1,000 retail outlets and 50% must be in communities affected by substance use. So, and this is another, I think, a loaded um, question, but that we want people who've been affected by substance use to have access to retail, because it's another way to make jobs, to have jobs. It's another way to start one's own business. And so we'll see what happens with that. Different cities, by the way, and this is for New York, they can opt out. So if they don't want to have a marijuana store in their town or village, they can opt out. And there will be, and this is true for New Jersey as well, there'll be an Office of Cannabis Management, an Office of Cannabis Management. And yeah, Stephanie, I don't know what the date for opting out is, but if, as you said, by December 31st, so the end of this year. I don't know that for sure, but I will trust you on that one. What I'll say, by the way, is just we'll pay attention to that and see what that happens. Some cities are glad to have retail, and others, you know what? Actually, there's no way to share something aloud, by the way, on WebEx. So you can write in what you want to, but I can't undo that. All right. So another thing that'll happen, and thanks for writing in, I appreciate that. There will be drug recognition experts will be trained to monitor driving while using marijuana. I had heard of this a couple of years ago, that how can people figure out whether the person is driving under the influence of alcohol or marijuana? So the term they're using is drug recognition experts. What Dr. Haney was saying yesterday, though, was that it's going to be very difficult to have any kind of like a breathalyzer for marijuana because it's done very differently than alcohol. And when you think about it, alcohol is a drug that is water soluble, meaning it really leaves you pretty quickly. Marijuana is fat soluble. I'll explain that more later on with some of the receptor sites, but what that means is that it stays in your system longer. So that if you get stopped, let's say today, but you smoked marijuana 30 days ago, will it still be in your system? Depends on how much you've smoked, and how regularly and what the amount is. But the drug recognition experts will probably go with behavioral things. So more will be revealed on that. So other kinds of things. Actually, I already said that smoking in public places violates public health law. According to the information I got from a variety of sources, including the Associated Press, that the regulations will be developed by April 2022. And just so you know, growing marijuana is still illegal, but beginning in October of 2023, it will be legal to grow 6 marijuana plants. So you got to wait on that one. All right, I just want to read thanks, Stephanie. Around New York State, there is a committee of people putting together presentations for different coalitions and agencies. Yes, and they will be afforded a presentation by SAM and an attorney. I believe there's a fee for this, but it is to help educate those on the policies for municipalities that either want to opt in or out regarding the dispensaries and other things that come along with that. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And that's part of the whole kind of preparation of what all of this entails. So more will be revealed, but thank you for bringing those, because if you are in a situation where you want to know more information, and actually you can Google this with New York State and marijuana law. It's always just interesting when you Google that. Sometimes you get places like the Associated Press. This also came from Forbes. Some of the other information that I Googled comes from some of the marijuana agencies. So I always like to know who I am reading and who I'm reading from, and is it appropriate to share in a training. Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, Stephanie. There is a lot of information, and as people comb through it all, it will be complex, but it's where we are, and we'll see what happens. But sometimes what some of the states are also looking at, like New York and New Jersey, is they're looking at other states that legalized recreational marijuana a few years ago, and they're looking at what works, what doesn't work, and what they can do to avoid some of the things that don't work. So more will be revealed, but thank you for sharing that so everybody can see that in the chat, and I appreciate that. All right, this is another one I think that's very important, and this is about expungement. And it's interesting because in New York they had done expungement of records for convictions of possession of marijuana. They had done that actually about a year ago, and it's also included in this. And so just this affects a lot of the people who we work with, and many of the clients. So all records for convictions will automatically be expunged. And that just means that the court records will be marked as expunged and sealed. That means that most people will not have access to them. What does that mean? I know, as if I have any voc rehab counselors there, we are always looking at, when people get a job, what's their criminal record? What do people have access to? Even though that ban the box law has changed, but expunge means you shouldn't be able to get it. So that can be really helpful for many of our clients who were, I guess, not just arrested, but convicted on marijuana possession. I would always say to clients, you still always want to check your rap sheet just to make sure that they took everything off. And that what that should mean, and I'm saying should like in quotes, once a case is expunged, most employers should not see the conviction when you apply for a job. So that is not information that has to be shared, although now you're not supposed to share that in a an interview before you get the job. And it may be, for example, there may be some high security jobs, like if you're going to work for the FBI or the CIA or different kinds of things, they may have access to that. But it's important to follow through on that. And I am going to write in the chat the Legal Action Center, which is a wonderful place that whenever you have any questions about the law, they are really helpful. Now, they are in New York, but you can call them if you're in other places, or they have webinars very regularly. And they also have not just so much webinars, but they have really up-to-date information. So if you want to read something about disability and HIV, or what do all these new laws mean? What does ban the box mean? You can go to the Legal Action Center. All right, we'll go from New York to New Jersey. Now, in New Jersey, it was voted on in November 2020 and signed by Governor Murphy in February of 2021. So the answers are yes, it's legal to possess marijuana now. You may possess up to 6 ounces legally. So it depends where you live, by the way. In New York, it's supposed to be 3. In New Jersey, it is 6. And they'll also come up with guidelines about how much you can buy at a time. So state licensed cannabis stores will be able to sell up to 1 ounce per customer, 1 ounce per customer. And you may gift an adult, 21 years, up to 1 ounce. In my mind, I'm thinking, well, what does 1 ounce look like as opposed to 3 ounces? What are you going to use it for? But those are the guidelines that we have. Can you grow it in New Jersey? No. So those are some of the pieces about New Jersey. But another thing is they will have a cannabis, or they do have a cannabis regulatory commission. Sometimes when I hear, yeah, it's the new norm. It's when I hear cannabis regulatory commission or some of these agencies, I think of more jobs. And one thing New Jersey did say is that the state will save $127 million per year on marijuana possession enforcement costs. So think about, hopefully, from a financial point of view, that states will not have to spend a lot of money on enforcement costs. And also, states anticipate making a lot of money on the taxes to marijuana. So I know that's why a lot of states have done it as well. All right, so that's some of the basics about New York and New Jersey. And again, if you're from other states, I'll encourage you to find out for yourself, you know, what those guidelines are. So I'm going to segue to, right, sorry, there's the picture, marijuana and who is using it. So I am going to throw out a question, and I'll ask you to think about it. I don't know how many people I have on this on today. I'm reluctant to hit the participant list because sometimes I'll turn off the whole presentation, and I don't want to do that. But here's some questions to kind of think about. When you think about marijuana, let's do the first one. When you think about marijuana, what comes to mind? All right, and everybody can read, so younger, rowdy, longtime users, crowd. Anybody else, please write in. I know sometimes it takes a while to think of what you want to write and then to type it in. But when you think about marijuana, what comes to mind? Yeah, young people using recklessly, a younger crowd. Oh, thanks, Clyde. Clyde told me we have 145 people, so let's see what people are writing in. Unmotivated pot users, the munchies, leafy green substance, peer pressure, amotivational syndrome. We'll talk about that. Self-medication, harm reduction. Something I've outgrown and no longer interested in. Lazy and bad attitude, smelly. Kids eating pot cookies, young adults and unmotivated munchies. Repeat on that. It's hard to treat people who are actively using. I think of how the future rehabs can utilize it as a form of detox instead of using methadone. More will be revealed about that, by the way. It's natural, so it's no big deal. No understanding of risks. Potency caps. Marijuana cafes, we'll see that in the future. Pizza. Coping with stress. Oh, now we all want pizza, right? Medicinal options. Challenging to treat. That's going to be it'll be interesting, and we'll talk about that. And what I also do want to really talk about is what it has really been researched for. So it hasn't been researched for as many things as you would think, but I'll tell you by the end of the training what it's been researched for. Yeah, diagnosis of cancer or MS, yes. Unmotivated behavior, eating disorder, treat anxiety, urine screening, that's something we'll have to work with. Yeah, schizophrenia and marijuana seem to go together. Whether whether marijuana medicates the schizophrenia itself or whether it medicates the side effects of the medication is something to look at. All right. So what I see, by the way, is there's a whole variety of answers. And what I'm going to ask you to say is, or maybe to stop, uh, is that we'll look again, there's many different reasons about what comes to mind. I think if I were to jump to the third question, and I may not spend a lot of time on this because I have a decent amount of slides, but I think what's important for you to figure out for yourselves individually, and you don't have to share this, but when you think of marijuana and the people who use marijuana, are your thoughts, are they positive? Are they negative or mixed? And in many of our trainings, at least we used to do this a lot with in-person trainings, we looked at values clarification. Thanks, Brittany, for writing that in. And people can write that in if you'd like to. So it seems like it's mixed, at least the first two people out of 145. All right, I see lots of mixed. Yeah, we'll talk about younger people and the use, more negative. I think it's important to know if you're biased for it, that's a good thing to know where you are because, and people can see for those of you who've written into everyone, there's a lot of mixed, negative, and the reason I put that question in there is know your stuff. Because if you think it's positive, then maybe you'll work with somebody. Well, actually, whatever you think or feel, it may come out in working with your clients. I can give you examples of when I used to teach at NYU, and I had a student who told me a story about how he was smoking weed, and so he thought of it as very positive, and he was working at a site for people with mental health issues. And for some people with mental health issues, it's not a good thing. So you really need to look at kind of the whole picture. If you're negative about it, and for those of you who are in abstinence-based recovery, which, by the way, I think is wonderful. My late husband was in recovery for 30 years before he died, but he was very, for him, and he used to like marijuana, by the way, when he was using, but he was very strict about the use of a substance as part of his recovery. So I think you have to look at that. And then for those of you who work in harm reduction, sites, harm reduction works, and it works for some people. If you are working in a harm reduction site, you need to be comfortable with people using. So it's just one of those things to kind of think about. All right. And you don't have to, I think sometimes things evolved. Yeah, we'll talk actually about, again, what would, when people might use it. All right. So here's some examples. Now, this course, by the way, was originally done by one of the ATTCs out in California by a man named Tom Freese, who I've worked with on the methamphetamine courses, and there's always a purpose whenever we have slides up here, and here's what it is. So let's look at people who are using marijuana. So you have Joe, he's 23. He started using when he was 15, used through college, uses it pretty regularly, about 4 to 5 times a week. Uses it when he is stressed out. Now, you can see, by the way, the ages might increase as we go along. Here's a question, or here's a statement of a couple, Maria and Terry. They're 46 and 48 years old. Used in college, stopped when she got pregnant. Now smoked socially, and when they go to concerts. It's interesting too, because we haven't had concerts in a year, so concerts will be coming back again, we hope. What'll happen in terms of actually social distancing and marijuana use, I don't know, that'll be a whole nother course. What happens is Maria uses when she is stressed out, and Terry uses for pain stemming from HIV-related neuropathy. I'm going to say this now, and actually I'll say this later on, is that the research has shown that marijuana is good for neuropathy, and peripheral neuropathy is pain that is nerve pain. And for those people who've had it, it affects often a person's hands or feet, where to the point where you can't walk, or if you use your hands for your job, you can't. And actually, it's been shown, according to my friend Meg, Dr. Haney, that has been used for really well for peripheral neuropathy. What she was saying in the podcast was it's important to look at what kind of pain does it work for. So does it work for every pain? We don't really know that, but it does work for, yeah. CBD, I'll talk about that actually later on. Or I'll tell you that the interesting thing about CBD is that it has not been researched. Why? Because marijuana is still a Schedule 1 drug. What does that mean? Schedule 1 means that it's high potential for abuse, and no medical. So that's a whole nother political piece. But what she said was that CBD has not been shown for a lot of things. It has been shown, by the way, for seizures in children, and also for glioblastoma, which is the cancer, which is a brain cancer that's really kills people very, very quickly. So, what else I think it's too is, you go into a store that sells CBD oil. Now, you can get probably the real stuff from other states. If you go into a store, let's say in New York or New Jersey, everybody's selling CBD something. And, a couple of weeks ago, my shoulder had been bothering me, so I go into the vaping store near my apartment, and they have CBD oil. And I said, I don't know if it sounds obnoxious, but I'm like, what's the efficacy about this? Does this really work? And the gentleman said, yes, of course it does work. And it was very expensive. Like, he had one jar for $50, one for $70, one for $100. So I did buy the one for $50, but I have to say it didn't work for me. But other people, it works. So another thing too, Dr. Haney talked about is the placebo effect. If you think something's going to work, it probably will. It works for anxiety and pain, the placebo effect. So that's lots of information. Oh, you know what? I'll get into the THC CBD stuff as we go along. And thank you for asking. I'm just kind of jumping ahead to answer some of the questions as we go along. But for this couple, especially for Terry, used it for neuropathy. Now, here we have a picture of Elise, who never used marijuana until she turned 63. First used it to improve her appetite during chemotherapy, and some people have written in that privately, for breast cancer, so that sometimes it helps people with nausea, so that they can deal with the effects of chemotherapy. Now with Elise, that the cancer has returned and has gone to her spine, and conventional painkillers don't work, and so now she uses it several times a day for pain relief. So the key about why we had 3 different slides of 3 different people is that many people are using. So is smoking marijuana less dangerous than smoking cigarettes? The answer is no. And we'll talk about administration, but actually smoking any kind of drug, especially if you have bronchitis or any kind of lung issues, can be dangerous. Also, I mean, throwing COVID there, since COVID affected many people's lungs, then it would probably not be a good idea if you have COVID to be smoking cigarettes actually, or marijuana, or any kind of smoking. But they do say that smoking 5 marijuana joints a day can be as harmful as smoking 20 cigarettes a day. So 20 cigarettes, I believe, is a pack. So it can be. Yeah, you know what? I'm going to get actually to the difference between THC and CBD, and the different arrangements. So I think that's really important to know. So the question is, can people become addicted to marijuana? And the answer is yes. You know, now, here's what we also know is out of 100% of people, probably only 10% may become addicted to it. It's very similar to alcohol. You could have 100% of people drinking and maybe only 10% it becomes problematic. So that you can be, even though it sometimes people don't believe it, but if you read the DSM-5, there is a diagnosis. So, can it be used as a medicine? In some states, yes. And we'll talk about this more, but that the chemicals in the marijuana plant are used to treat some illnesses or symptoms. And the big challenge, by the way, is that the unprocessed marijuana plant is not recognized by the federal government or approved as a medicine by the FDA. And so it can be approved by states, but not by the federal government. Now, why do you need to know that? And will that change in the next couple of years? I don't know, but it means that if you're on Medicaid, and Medicaid is a federal program, and you want to use marijuana, you're going to have to pay for it yourself. It's not going to be paid for by the federal government. So I always like to know who's paying for what when I use something, or if they take my insurance when I go to the doctor. Now, other things, marijuana versus cannabis, is there a preferred term? You can actually use them interchangeably. I mean, sometimes when I'm talking, I'll use the term weed because people knows what we're talking about. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Carolina just wrote in something that there's a nice chart about the difference between the two. So that's something as people can go to after the course, and it's helpful to have this. And some of this will be on some of our slides as well. And thank you for writing that in. And you know, once I was doing this course and somebody wrote in about the term marijuana being racist. So I looked it up, and some people believe that, by the way, because the term marijuana is a Spanish word and that it was used in a kind of a pejorative sense in the 1930s. And I asked people at the ATTC, and they haven't heard about that as much, but I would say keep your antenna up about that. Now, under US law, cannabis is the plant itself, and marijuana and the hemp are specific parts of the plant. So hemp refers to the seeds, the stems, the stalks, and the roots, and marijuana is in reference to the viable seeds, the leaves, and flowers. And we'll get on actually on the next. Here's a glossary of terms. All right. So these are things you need to, or people have started to talk about, which I appreciate, about cannabidiol, so CBD. It's a cannabinoid that doesn't make people high. May be useful in reducing pain and inflammation and controlling epileptic seizures. It has been shown, by the way, to help with seizures in children. Now, in other parts of the key terms are cannabinoids. So it's the chemical compounds that act on the neurotransmitters of the brain. And so it's important to kind of know what those are as well. And then the other big thing that most people know is about THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and that's the psychoactive compound found in the cannabis plant. So some of the medications, by the way, that the CBD oil, actually, and CBD oil has very, very, very low THC, even if you buy it from like a place that in another state where you can look at it. And then terpenoids deal with the flavor and aromatic compounds of cannabis. So those, I think, important things to kind of look at is the cannabidiols versus the THC. So THC is the part that gets people high. Oh, here's something that came from SAMHSA as well. And some of you may have seen this in some of our other courses. What they look at, by the way, is marijuana is the #1 illicit drug used in the United States among people 12 and older. So if you look on, again, illicit is, it's still not legal by the federal government, and that's why marijuana is there as a, quote, illicit drug, even though it is legal in some of your states. They do some studies. These are self-report, by the way, and this is what people found. No past month illicit drug use, 89.4% of people. That's in the United States. And the past month, about 10.6%. And so it includes, by the way, the population of 12 and older. So if you look at the chart on the left, you could see obviously that marijuana is the most common one. And we're talking illicit, so that's why alcohol and tobacco are not there. Interestingly enough, alcohol and tobacco are the two legal drugs that actually do the most damage to people, other than some of the, they are the two drugs that do the most damage. And why they're legal is a whole political piece on that one. And I think politics will come into play with marijuana as well. So you can see on that right-hand corner, people are using marijuana, the misuse of prescription pain relievers. Many of you are working with clients who are, have been using Vicodin or OxyContin, or tranquilizers like Librium or Valium, and you kind of work your way down. It's interesting because the numbers for heroin look pretty low, and many of us have been in business for a long time working with people who have been using heroin. So why do people use marijuana? This came from the Pew Charitable Trust Fund, and I realize this is a little bit older, and I didn't go back to see what they've said recently, other than the Pew Trust Foundation is really good when you want to look at attitudes of things. But here's what they asked. They asked people, why did you use it? 47% said they used it for fun, 30% for medical reasons, and 23% reported using it for fun and medical reasons. So people are using it for a variety of reasons. Now, these are questions actually that come up a lot. And is marijuana use associated with an increased risk of opioid misuse? What I think is interesting, even though it says there that respondents who reported past year marijuana use had a 2.2 times higher odds than non-users of meeting diagnostic criteria for prescription opioid use disorder by follow-up. I wrote down in my notes, I think it depends. When we talk about the gateway theory, that people start with a drug, and it could be anything from like tobacco or alcohol or marijuana. One of the reasons and why sometimes the gateway theory is a little bit, I think, skewed, because they developed the gateway theory based on working in treatment with people who've used drugs. And let's say somebody's in treatment for heroin or methamphetamines, and then they ask people, so what did you start with? And they kind of worked backwards. So we'll see what's happened with that. Somebody was telling me in a training recently that they wish they had been able to use marijuana at a younger age. They would not have used heroin. But if they had had access to marijuana, it would have been more helpful. Yes, in New York State, is an opioid addiction one of the qualifying conditions for medical marijuana? It's supposed to be. Actually, I have a list of in New York State. It's a there's 14 qualifying conditions, and actually opioid use disorder is on there. I can read them actually now because each state, by the way, is going to have different qualifying conditions, and New York has 14 at the moment. I'll read a few of them. Cancer, HIV, and AIDS. So if you work in the field of HIV, people have used marijuana to increase appetite or deal with peripheral neuropathy. Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, there's a fair amount of illnesses like around like inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease, Huntington's disease, chronic pain, PTSD, and opioid use disorder. So yes, there's 14 of them as well. And again, it'll vary according to the state. So other other things. Oh, and actually there have been recent papers, by the way, that says that if marijuana has been shown to reduce pain, it may provide an alternative to pain medication so that people, and by the way, there's nothing wrong with pain medication if you have pain, but it just may be another alternative that may be healthier for people. All right, so link between medical marijuana and fewer opioid deaths. This is more complex. And what I can say is that, as it says there, the states that more recently adopted laws with medical marijuana, actually they regulated them. So they looked at obviously reduced harm, and yeah, again, a lot of the overdose deaths in the United States have been caused by, and this is very East Coast, by the way. For those of you who are on the West Coast, it's different, but heroin and some of the synthetic opioids like fentanyl, but not prescription medications. So there's a lot more, because there's a lot more, actually, there needs to be a lot more research on this, and that's what Dr. Haney would say. So, other things. Sometimes too, if you're doing research about a quote illegal drug, it's hard to get real research because you're not always sure about what the numbers are. Here's what we know, or we think we know, that use among youth has not increased until recently, despite decreased perception of risk. So for a lot of young people, there is a very low perception of risk. It's interesting because in the pandemic, they found that people who were 26 and older were using more substances than adolescents. Why? Because adolescents, if you were home, you didn't have as much access to getting your substance. Although I know you can get it delivered in a lot of cases, but it's something to look at. By the way, this course, by the way, and what I was saying at the beginning, if you're in recovery, you're going to have to figure out what you're going to do about some of this information. So it's not a commercial to use, by the way, if it's not a good thing for you to use. For some people, it may be. And here's what we know in addition, and many of people are familiar with this, more current users are using more frequently, that the potency is increasing. It's been increasing like ever since the 60s because of the agriculture that we have, and it's also administered through different routes, and we'll talk about that as well. So what do we need to know about marijuana use? Basically what we really need to have is a lot more information. In fact, what Dr. Haney was saying, and I'm going to write this in the chat because it was called The Blunt Truth About Weed. So I'm going to write that in the chat because it was really fascinating. The Blunt Truth About Weed. And it's a podcast. And Dr. Meg Haney. And she's at Columbia, although the podcast was done. The science guy, Bill Nye, he was on it as well. So, but they were asking her, she believes science rules, and uh, where did I get the information? Actually, from the ATTC site. And, it's interesting too. And one of the reasons why, we have these courses and then you learn more stuff and you're like, should I go back and change this today? And one of the things that she said was that there is not a link necessarily between marijuana and lung cancer. They have not proven that, by the way. So that's why when we share information like about 5 joints equaling 20 cigarettes, I think the main thing to look at is, when you buy weed too, until you can buy weed that is legal, you don't really know what's in it. And with a lot of the drugs that people are using, so you don't know about the potency, you don't know what it's cut with. So there could be a lot of other things that can be dangerous to people. So there's just, again, a lot that we don't know. And she said in an ideal world, she would love to spend some time doing research. And she said it's been hard during the pandemic to do the research because they do the research and they have to use marijuana that is grown in, there's like a government marijuana farm. And I forget, I don't know if it's in Kentucky, but they have to use, she said it's very hard to get these days. And it's the only one you can use. She can't like go out on the street and get some marijuana, even in places where it's legal to use for her research. So what she's really just says is we just really need to know a lot. There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot of potential. Yes, and that actually, what's interesting is that marijuana is being laced with fentanyl. I have heard that as well. Lots of things have been laced with fentanyl. So how do you know what you're getting? In fact, one of the harm reduction thing is to go to the same dealer all the time so you can trust that person. But as somebody was telling me recently too, is that they had Valium and that was laced with fentanyl. And think about it. You buy Valium to relax, and then fentanyl, you really relax too much, and people overdose. And that's the danger of really what's going on with a lot of the drugs that you buy on the street. So yeah, there's so much going on about that. All right, so we're kind of going back to segueing back to what is marijuana, and this will talk about some of the different kinds. It's interesting because if you go on like a website that sells marijuana, I mean, the marketing is kind of I find it kind of fascinating. But so what is it? Dry shredded mix of leaves, flower stems, usually from the Cannabis sativa or the Cannabis indica. Both are common subspecies of the hemp plant and can be found throughout the world. There are it's interesting because there are 400 chemical compounds in marijuana. Now, it's interesting too, because I think somebody wrote this at the beginning, is a lot of times a client would say, well, it's natural, because it grows. And I would sometimes say when I was really anti, it's like lots of things are natural, but I wouldn't smoke them or eat them. But that term natural is not defined, by the way, clearly by the FDA. Common names, this may vary according to where you are, to your age, and important. Oh yeah, benzodiazepines taken with opioids, deadly. Can be, yeah. It's interesting too, because when people are mixing, 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2. And if you take 2 drugs that lower your tension level, Oh, can be. I wasn't sure if it was Canberra in Australia, but those two combinations not good. Another one too, and this is from my courses in methamphetamines. What's been happening a lot of times when people are mixing heroin and methamphetamines, they're also overdosing. Why? Because if you were just using heroin, you would kind of have an idea of, as you kind of started, your breathing starts to decrease, you'd kind of have an idea of what was going on, or people who are with you would understand. But if you've been taking methamphetamines, you still feel kind of happy and alert, and a lot of people cannot tell when they're close to overdosing. So that's a common combination that can be deadly as well. And then yeah, the combination, it decreases respiration. So it's like the benzos like Valium or Ativan, which people like to use, sometimes prescribed, sometimes not. With heroin, they're both depressant drugs, and the combination really, when people overdose, you stop breathing. As opposed to if you overdose on a stimulant, it increases tension level, and then people will have heart attacks or strokes. So it's a different way of how that kind of works. Thank you, doctor, for sharing that. Now, just to kind of break it down, it's interesting. If you go to some of those sites that sell marijuana, they'll tell you what's the sativa, what's the indica, and a lot of times there's hybrids, and so you have choices. But here's what we know, or what we think we know. Well, actually, what we do know. They are different in a sense, and if you're an agriculturalist, you would probably know it's like different kinds of flower, or same flower, different kind of little bit different. So the sativa, long, thin leaves, light color. You could see that the growing patterns are different. Maybe the height is different, the time, the weeks it takes to flowering is different. And I think what people are familiar with is the different type of high, so that sometimes people will use sativa because it makes people euphoric, creative, alert, energetic, cheerful, sociable. That's kind of used in the day, whereas the indica is sometimes used at night because you get couch lock, you're carefree, you're calm, relaxed, sleepy, mellow. I've been using that term couch lock a lot during the pandemic, how sometimes you sit down to watch television and you can't get up because luckily, fortunately, things are opening up again. But people will figure out in terms of, it's like when you're buying a product, what do you want the product to do and what is it going to help the most with? So that is some information about that as well. Now, how is it used? It is smoked, can be smoked in a variety of places or a variety of ways. And as it says there, you could have a pipe or a bowl or a cigarette. Rapid effects. I mean, smoking a drug gives you rapid effects. Why? Because as you take vapor or smoke, it goes into your lungs, to your heart, to your brain very quickly. And that's why smoking a drug can be actually is one of the first routes, or the quickest routes to becoming addicted. So smoked, vaporized, so inhaled through a machine, has very rapid effects, doesn't release toxins. I'm going to say one of the challenges, by the way, remember last year, a lot of adolescents, or maybe this is pre-pandemic, were using a vaporizer and they were smoking CBD oil, and a lot of young people died. So that I can tell you why that happens, but again, because the CBD oil and marijuana is a fat soluble drug. When you take it in, it looks for fat cells and it stays there. So that's why, for I think younger body, less developed immune system, was very dangerous for people. But a lot of times people would use like vaping. I'm going to say, for those of you who are in harm reduction, there probably are healthy ways to do it. But if you're an adolescent, I'd be nervous. Now, you can eat it, and it's in baked goods. It does take time. It's like any drug. If you eat it, it's going to take longer. for it to kick in. Even if you take an aspirin or Tylenol, it usually takes 10 to 20 minutes to kick in. Not as toxic. The big challenge is with edibles is that sometimes people eat too many because they don't feel high right away. Or you hear these like anecdotal stories where somebody, a grandparent goes into, they're staying with one of their grandchildren who has a lot of brownies that have been infused with marijuana, and they eat a few of them. So it's easy to actually overdose on, you want to be able to kind of know what that is. All right, other forms, and it'll be interesting too, because as you go into one of those, the marijuana stores, they have it in a variety of ways. You can get like a tincture, you can get the plant itself, you can get it on different kinds of foods. And so you may see that more in the future. So hashish is something that is a compressed resin of cannabis plant, more concentrated and potent than marijuana plant. Many years ago, I was working in Morocco one summer, and actually hashish was very common. Hash oil or wax, you may see this, for example, it's more potent, 3 to 4 times as potent as a marijuana plant. And we'll just have to see what happens in terms of what people are selling and how to work with that. Now, synthetic marijuana, so spice or K2, the big challenge with K2 is that it's really not marijuana. And the fact that people call it synthetic marijuana means that people often think that it is not dangerous, and unfortunately, it is. There's a lot of chemicals and different herbs that it gives a kind of a really gives like a similar to marijuana high, but for many people, it is extremely dangerous because you don't know what's in it, and you can buy it. You can buy it on the street. You can buy it in some delis, and it's why sometimes you know how sometimes with drugs, if you use some of those common elements that are not illegal, you could sell it legally. But I remember when I was going up to my job near the armory, there was a homeless shelter, and I'd usually stop for coffee like on the corner, and there would be a lot of the guys from the homeless shelter talking, and they were just talking about how wonderful K2 was because it was cheap and easy to get to. They also thought at the time it wasn't tested, if they were going for like back to the welfare office or something. But it's not marijuana. It's not even close. In fact, probably it's been given a bad, again, because people think it's harmless because it has the word marijuana in there. Okay, so moving right along to, I hope everybody is finding this interesting. I haven't been asking you as many questions, and I do appreciate, again, people writing in comments. So when we look at the brain, here's a couple of things to keep in mind. See on the left-hand side, you could see where it says THC receptors. If you've taken courses, remember we always study like Neurochemistry 101 for substance use counselors. The receptor sites are important, and we do have the receptor sites in our brain. And the receptor sites, they're all through, actually, they're all through the body, but they're all through the brain. And for the ones that are THC receptor sites, they are near the part of the brain that deals with pleasure and pain. They're near the amygdala. Remember, the amygdala deals a lot with, it's that part of the brain that tells you fight or flight or run, freeze. And so it's one of the reasons why, let me just see what, it's one of the reasons why it works. And again, it affects, as I said, pain, appetite, vomiting reflex. And again, for many people going through chemotherapy or dealing with HIV, living with HIV, and not being able to eat, it can be helpful. What I will say that is that Marijuana does have withdrawal because everybody always say, oh, you don't withdraw from weed, and you do. It just takes a longer time. It takes about 24 hours, as opposed to, let's say, heroin or even alcohol. It's a much quicker withdrawal. Now, the effects generally last 1 to 4 hours. Again, going back to what people were talking about, if it's cut with something else, you don't know how long it's going to last. So what are some of the immediate effects? You can see on the left-hand side, kind of all the reasons people might use it. The one that stands out for me is to reduce anxiety. It does make people hungry. Sensory intensification. Some of those people, I worked a lot with patients who were artists or writers, and they always smoked weed before they wrote or composed something. And so they were always afraid to give it up because they were afraid that they would be giving up their creativity. There's been actually a fair amount of research on that because it's not necessarily the creativity comes from within, but I guess it's released through the marijuana. But a lot of times when people got into recovery, they did just as well. So it's one of those it depends answers. And again, the effects will be different depending on what you're using. Acute effects in the intoxication fee. Here's a couple of things to look at because I think this is important to know, is when you look at cognition, difficulty learning. This is why one of the reasons, and I know there's a slide on this about adolescence, but it's probably not a good idea to be in school and smoking weed because these are some things that could happen in terms of your ability to function. And it also affects decision making. And for some people, anxiety, panic attacks, psychosis, or paranoia. Some people have been known to have allergies to marijuana. And there was some research that was done at Rockland Psychiatric Hospital. And there was a doctor there. This was a while ago, but it was interesting that he was working with a lot of adolescents. And the adolescents had come in. They came into the hospital because of psychosis. They were having hallucinations and they were having different kinds of things. Yeah, hallucinations and delusions. And what he asked them to do was, and they told him they were smoking marijuana. He asked them to stop smoking marijuana, and guess what happened? The psychosis went away. The hallucinations and the delusions went away. And now I know some of you who are out there know that that doesn't happen. Usually if somebody has schizophrenia, it doesn't go away. It can be managed, but it doesn't disappear. And so his theory was that some people have an allergy to it, where it does affect them. Now, people say, how do you know if you have an allergy to it? You don't. You have to try it, I suppose, to find out. Or I will say that if somebody in your family has had a bad reaction to a certain substance, you might not want to use that substance. Or it's the same thing. It's like when they're looking at antidepressants. If it works well with somebody in a family, they might make a diagnosis or prescribe it. So that is just something to keep in mind. Yeah, the psychosis, especially it's the hallucinations. And like a lot of drugs do cause hallucinations. Sometimes people have hallucinations on their own without a substance. And for some people, when they use marijuana, they do have hallucinations. All right. Now, other things, if you look on the left-hand side, it's really, if you're reading the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, on the left-hand side. Yeah, some people do have panic attacks. It's interesting, and I'll tell you a story that Dr. Haney talked about is, and this is about research. She said that maybe there was a research paper where there were 20 students in a class and they had to give a presentation and they were all nervous. They were all given marijuana and then they all became relaxed. So then word on the street is, oh, take it because it makes you relax. Some people have the opposite, and some people have panic attacks. So it's really, again, people have panic attacks without the substance, without substances, and people do have panic attacks with certain substances. And for some people, marijuana is one of those. On the left-hand side, actually, these are what happens when people withdraw. And this, again, is from the DSM-5. So that, and actually what people were saying, what did some of the doctors I've talked to have said, that what they see a lot is the irritability and craving for using the substance. And for some people, if they had been medicating for anxiety, then the anxiety comes back. What are some of the treatment options? You could see, by the way, some of those treatment options are all evidence-based practices for substance use in general. Some of you are really good at motivational enhancement therapy, CBT, cognitive behavioral, contingency management, which has come back, and family-based treatment. Contingency management is something that was like designed way back and used for substances, and now it's coming back for methamphetamines, and it's about reward systems. But so those are being used. You know, unfortunately, and this came from National Institute of Drug Abuse in 2016, so that's only 5 years ago. They said there's only a 10 to 30% success rate in achieving abstinence. That to me was depressing, especially for those of you who work in treatment. It's like, okay. There's no approved medications available. Sometimes there'll be drugs to treat the symptoms, but it's not like using buprenorphine for heroin. There's still, I think sometimes people are using off-label things, but there's no approved things that we know. One of the challenges, I think, in when I worked in treatment, if somebody came in for cannabis, all the other patients were like, wow, you are so lucky. I came in here for heroin. I came in here for crack cocaine. And their perception was that the people were really lucky. But if you look at what kind of the addiction, it has kind of the same consequences that people had, but the perception was that it was not, quote, as bad. Now, adolescence. I think this is an important, it's interesting because a lot of adolescents like to smoke weed, but here's what we know. And this one I am a little stricter on. Some of the studies suggest that it may cause brain structural changes. What happens with an adolescent is their brain is still developing. And so by using a substance that is fat soluble and stays in your brain and your body, it really affects, it can decrease memory. There's something called amotivational syndrome, which means that people lose motivation to do anything. There used to be a commercial where this gentleman, this guy would come down from his room. He's about 38 years old, and he was living with his parents, and he would say, marijuana didn't do anything for me, or it didn't hurt me at all. It's one of those, maybe you had to be there, because I think a lot of people did go home during the pandemic to live with their parents, but it was just the idea that he might have been able to do other kinds of things. And for our young people too, we don't want to actually, people are dealing with a lot of challenges, and so we don't want to give them another one. So we don't want to, again, from a learning point of view, work with that. Another one, and Dr. Haney was very clear about this, by the way, is that use during pregnancy also is very, I mean, she was very strict. She used the word criminal, and she said that's not the way she usually operates with people, but she said that if a woman is pregnant and the fetus, the brain of the fetus is not really developed, and so it can be very dangerous for um, for babies who are sorry, I'm trying to figure out the correct terms for fetuses, by the way, who are not born, that for them to, since whatever the mother takes is the fetus will take that in as well. Yes, thank you, doctor. It crosses the placental barrier. Thank you for helping me out on that one. And that where, again, can affect the development of the baby. Thank you. Um, According to the Texas Tech University, the marijuana has been found in breast milk, although subclinical, so not as much. Although often what happens is whatever the mother takes in can be in breast milk. So, but again, if you can work with people around that, but she was pretty clear about that she was pretty strict about that one. So I'm going to kind of segue to, as I'm looking at the clock and my I start talking fast because I'm from New York. Here's just some things I think to keep in mind. We just kind of looked at kind of the marijuana 101 and just some interesting things I think about marijuana and state law or medical marijuana. And it's interesting because one of the pieces at the bottom said it's the only drug approved for medical use through political process rather than scientific trials and research. So it's like we all voted for it. Whereas, like, do we vote for cancer drugs? No, but we voted for this. And so some of the researchers were saying that it is kind of an unconventional approach to making decisions about medicine. So we didn't ask a lot of doctors, we just asked people. A number of states, by the way, have, and this is more on medical, by the way, and they've gotten it through votes in state legislatures and through the ballots. The latest states who decided in 2020 for medical marijuana are Mississippi, Idaho, Nebraska, and South Dakota. And so that is what people voted for. Now, what gets sometimes confusing is federal law versus state law. So how can something be illegal by the federal government? And they consider, by the way, medical marijuana, any kind of marijuana use is illegal, but this is what we think we know. So most drug arrests are made by local or state law enforcement, and so they enforce state laws. And that federal law enforcement of marijuana law is rare, varies depending on the political climate. So, it speaks to, for example, I remember when Massachusetts legalized recreational marijuana, that a lot of the towns in western Massachusetts became very very profitable because people were driving from New York to Massachusetts. But that's again for legal marijuana. So, but it's why again that there can be the legal marijuana, the medical marijuana places. Now, some of the states that have approved recreational marijuana recently, we kind of went over this, and that's New York and New Jersey, Montana, Arizona, South Dakota, which also legalized medical marijuana. And just so you know, and this will come about, for example, in New York and New Jersey or some of these states, is that these states on this list have already had legalized recreational marijuana: Alaska, Colorado, Washington, Oregon, California. And I think the important thing is that they came up with different kind of guidelines on how much you could buy at a time. Like, you're not going to go to Costco and buy, at least not now, you're not going to go to Costco and just buy like all your marijuana for the next 6 months, that there are going to be very specific about how much you could buy at a time and what the per dose servings as well. So it's kind of interesting. And also, depending on whether you're buying a liquid or you're buying an edible, they really break that down. Seems like Colorado and California have kind of the more liberal laws on that one. Now, cannabis advertising is important as well, or becomes, again, will be part of that law. So this is what some of the states have already had. So in Oregon, you can't have strain names like Luke Skywalker or Girl Scout Cookie. It's interesting because go to those places and you'll see all kinds of interesting names, but they don't want to make them likable by children and adolescents. In the state of Washington, no advertising within 1,000 feet of whether it's of sensitive use. So that could be like a school, um, or different kinds of advertising. So no billboards. So I go to the state of Washington pretty regularly to visit family. And whenever you kind of go by one of the weed stores, they're very kind of nondescript. So it's not like these gigantic neon signs with like buy weed here. They tend to be low key. In Colorado, no billboards or outdoor signs. Alaska, no strong warning language, no promotions. And actually, California, I don't know if we have anybody from California on today, but they tend to have the weakest rules to date. I'm not picking on California, but might be because I watch Bill Maher every Friday night and he talks about cannabis in California, but they have had they have had less stringent. So we'll see what happens like in New Jersey and New York about what will happen in terms of advertising. I've already said this like a number of times. Again, I think the key about science lagging behind policy is really important. And in terms of health messaging, again, should be nuanced. It's hard to control the message, by the way, even if there is product marketing. But we'll look at that as we go along. All right. Did I just skip over one? So other things around some of the policy issues. I'm going to say, luckily, I've already done a lot of this stuff. But I think, again, states are going to have really diverse policies about how they set things up. And not to be cynical, but big money will always influence state legalization efforts and will increase. So I'm sure some of the big companies have already, or some of the big drug companies have already figured out ways to figure out how they can work with this. So we'll see what happens with that. Let's see. I don't know if I skipped over one. So again, I've said this a number of times, and again, marijuana has been used as a medicine. So I'm kind of segueing back to medicine. So here's a couple of things that we know. That it does help some people with pleasure, relaxation. It does affect memory and coordination, although it can affect coordination, by the way, in a kind of a negative way. If you, but for some people with MS, it's been working. Pain control, appetite and vomiting reflex, and that seems to have been one of the common ones that people share about in some of the trainings and in some of the literature. So what are some of the, why is it used? And this kind of goes to, people asked this at the beginning. So CBD oil is a non-psychoactive compound, and it does not affect motor functioning. So it's the non-psychoactive, but actually when you buy CBD oil in the store, I just kind of lost the exact title, the exact number of it, but it's something like 0.03% of any kind of psychoactive piece. But again, one of the things, and this is what Dr. Haney talks about, when you buy something that's not FDA approved, you have no idea really how much CBD oil is in there, or CBD plant. So the plants might have kind of some moderate THC, so there's effects, but it's not FDA approved. And I just want to be kind of clear that, because I know on the next slide, or two slides down, it's been used for about 50 different diseases, but the only ones that have been done in studies are seizures in children, glioblastoma, which is the cancer that John McCain, and because it may have anti-tumor effects, and that's what we want to find out. We want to look more at that, and actually peripheral neuropathy, or the pain from peripheral neuropathy. Yeah, and actually CBD actually has been used successfully, by the way, to help with seizures in children, and that's where it has been studied. So thank you for writing that, Dr. Ellis, because you hear of stories where parents are living in states where they can't get it, and they've moved to Colorado to be able to care for their children. So that has been shown to work. There's a place, actually, it was on, I think, 60 Minutes or one of the news shows, called Charlotte's Web, and it was these three brothers who started started growing marijuana, actually, to produce CBD oil, and they named it after one of the young women who came there as a client. So yes, it can help with seizures in children. That has been shown to work. Other kinds of things that people might be familiar with. Different types. So in some places you'll be able to get the plant. One of the things too is that in some places, things like Marinol, people have used that for chemotherapy for many years. It's been approved for HIV. There's some other medications you can get in other countries. And so there's been a variety of things that have been used. It's interesting. I was sick of, like, many years ago, and I was prescribed Marinol. It wasn't covered by my insurance company. It was very expensive. So I don't know if that it's covered now, but those are kind of the questions I would like to figure out. But these are all different ways of how it is used. One of the things too is about, the medical marijuana places where you go to get it. Like, I like to do research where I go to a place, like I'll go to an agency and try to figure out or learn more about it. And you can't do that. Actually, you can't just get in there and go for a tour. And I went to a presentation that a doctor gave who lives near where I live, and actually she is a certified medical marijuana practitioner, and so she's an MD, and her specialty is prescribing medical marijuana, and she was the one actually who gave me the 14 qualifying conditions. And I was telling her about somebody in my family who went to one of those places, and this person has bipolar disorder, and they did not do an assessment. The pharmacist did not do an assessment to find out whether there was there was bipolar disorder, and she actually suggested that that probably was not a good thing to do. So it really speaks to, again, oh yeah, the Marinol can, yes, be positive tox screen for marijuana. So you need to actually, if you're going for a job interview or getting drug tested, you need to let people know what you're doing. What would I recommend for inflammation and pain? You know what? I'm not a doctor, so I know there's some doctors on here, so I need to kind of stay in my lane on that one. So I'm sorry that if other people want to answer that question, I it's out of my wheelhouse to tell you what to do for inflammation and pain. Now, these are the conditions across the country, by the way, which have been used. Now, why they actually have pain as a big one. Oh yeah, thanks thanks, Gladys. So the Marinol is paid by insurance, so that's a good thing. And yeah, and it's interesting too, and I think what I think is good about Marinol is that it's taken as a pill. So think about if you have an illness, do you want to smoke a drug or do you want to take a pill? Everybody makes their own decisions on that. Me personally, I would take a pill over smoking a drug because I don't want to deal with kind of the side effects. But actually, if people do smoke cigarettes, they may choose the smoking. You could see actually from like 1 through 50, this is what it's been used for. But like I was saying, it's really only been shown to work for like 3 of those. And again, uh, we really need actually a lot more research on that. So this is one of the last slides, by the way, and you could see that there's most of the research has been on the plant, but once we're able to, we may start seeing a lot more done on edibles. And again, remember routes of administration. Some things work faster than others. I think also in the future that if you look at some of the extracts and the resins, that actually people like to use, like when they're dabbing or vaping, they do have high THC levels, but there's a lot of stuff, a lot of information that we don't know. So I'm just going to I'm going to take a quick look, by the way, because we still have more time. Here's these are some of my notes from Dr. Haney. And actually, I was saying that she does these studies and she'll have people stay at the hospital for a week smoking marijuana. She has some that are 3 weeks and they can't leave because they want to make sure that they keep the environment very controlled. Yeah, so you encourage patient to get Marinol, then smoke marijuana, or to follow medical recommendations. Bottom line is people are going to make their own decisions about what they do, and that's what I'll just say. People make their own decisions. Oh, the farm is in Mississippi, by the way, and it's the only marijuana that can be used in research. And she said that there's no sobriety test. One training I went to said that in Canada they do have a sobriety test, but that it was very expensive. But that again, it's going to be hard to have a sobriety test because it's fat soluble and gets into our fat cells. She did say that for people who have heart problems, that sometimes smoking marijuana or using marijuana as medicine may not be the best thing because for some people it increases the heart by 10 beats. And she said again, we can't study CBD oil until it's approved by the FDA. Other things she said. Yeah, she talked about, again, the receptor sites, which I went over. She just said really that the public has jumped ahead of the science. The public has jumped ahead of the science. And also that placebos work well for pain and anxiety. So that's kind of interesting to know that a placebo will work well for pain and it'll work well for anxiety. Easy for me to say, but I'm just quoting her on that one. So that was one of my last slides. There's no lack of information, by the way, on marijuana, and these are just some of the examples. I use a lot NIDA, the National Institute of Drug Abuse, because our program is funded by SAMHSA, but there's a whole variety of things there. I'd also encourage you to listen to the podcast by Dr. Haney. And what questions can I answer? What questions do you have that I can answer? Yeah, thanks, Gladys. The patients need to measure the pro and con, moreover, if they have multiple medical conditions. And I think that's important. They figure out for themselves, and it also takes into account, and that's where I think the doctors can be helpful when there's a lot of medical conditions. What's the best thing? And they'll figure it out. We help them figure out, or we help them make the decisions on that one. And I think that is really useful. Any other questions? Oh, this is all, yeah, personally, I've been waiting for it to be legal. It is interesting that marijuana is being legalized. There's talk of banning the flavored cigars that some of our clients used to smoke it. That's again, it's interesting because you can have a substance like a drug that is okay, and then you put in some kind of flavoring, and that makes it dangerous. Oh, some doctors have issues. Best treatment modality for marijuana use? I'm gonna guess that outpatient might be the best, or outpatient might be what people will have access to. I don't think you're going to see people getting any kind of residential. If other people want to write in about what they think in terms of the best modality. It's interesting too because there used to be, like, I mean, in a lot of places there's a lot of NA meetings and AA meetings, and there's Marijuana Anonymous in New York City. I don't know if it still exists after the pandemic, but sometimes it's helpful for people. Let's see. Oh, yes, Deborah. What that meant was that in New York, I'm going to say, is that it's almost like reparations, that because because substances have affected so many poor areas, that it's anticipated that the retail should be actually run by people of color, instead of other people taking over. The challenge is that there's so many. Let's say, for example, in certain areas of New York, there's a lot of alcohols, like liquor stores in poor areas. So is it good to have the marijuana stores in poor areas or not? But you want to give people the opportunity to make money on it as well. So that's what I kind of meant by that. And I probably was putting, instead of substance use effective areas, probably poor areas where people are poor. Dangers of vaping. Uh, Oh, actually, Monica, thank you. Marijuana Anonymous has a bunch of phone meetings. Good. The vaping challenge is what you're vaping with. And if you vape and you're using CBD oil, you are inhaling the vapors from an oil that will stay in your fat cells, and that can be really dangerous. Probably if somebody were vaping tobacco, or kind of a pure form of marijuana, it would not be dangerous. But a lot of young people are vaping CBD oil, and that's really dangerous. Yeah, thanks. Thanks. We typically treat cannabis disorder as outpatient. That's what I thought would happen. Co-occurring disorders, um, along with other factors, residential. So yeah, and thank you for saying that, because if cannabis disorder was the only thing you had, again, people would look at that as outpatient would work. But the co-occurring disorders increases other disabilities or other illnesses. And actually CBT works really well. Thank you for writing that in. And actually, thanks, Monica, for writing in the MA phone organization. A lot of meetings of NA, AA, Al-Anon are now online, and that can be good for some people or not. The retail marijuana becomes yes, that the source of income, and I think it's giving people in communities that have been underserved an ability to make money. It's interesting. When I was in Seattle, my sister was telling me a story about, you kind of go in, and then all the marijuana stores are run by like these young men. And, we want to give everybody a chance, and that's going to be a challenge. But they've also looked at the taxes, what's going to happen with a tax on marijuana, so that they can use that for drug treatment, interestingly enough. and you don't want to make the taxes too high, because if the taxes are too high, people will buy it on the street. And that's happened in some states. Thanks, Jacinta. Yeah, well, marijuana on the immune system, again, remember, so the immune system is made up of white blood cells. And again, depending on what you are getting, like if you're buying marijuana on the street, you're dealing with other kinds of things, and that can impact the immune system. Smoking a drug can impact the immune system. Not, I mean, alcohol, by the way, destroys white blood cells, so that's part of the immune system. But I'm going to say that's why sometimes I think people need to be careful, because if you are persons living with HIV and their immune system is compromised, you want to make sure they're getting the best medication for them that does not make them sicker. Make sense? So those are things I appreciate, again, people writing in. Yeah, you know what, from a harm reduction point of view, there are going to be people who get off heroin or methamphetamines and may continue to smoke weed. Demi Lovato is on television recently, and she said her sobriety now is she's not using, I forget what her initial drug was, but she's not using heroin, she's not using cocaine, but she's smoking weed and she's drinking occasionally, and she said for her it works. Now, people get nervous about that. Um, so yeah, it would be safer to, if you buy something in a weed store, you know what you're getting. Oh yeah, it's called California Sober. I thought that was kind of fascinating. So that's the the definition of California Sober. Yeah, Keith Richards does that also. You know, it's interesting. Keith Richards, I don't know how old he is, but he's been using drugs like for more than 50 years. And so yes, he does that. And he was a heroin addict, and now drinks and smokes weed. Yeah, it is a form of harm reduction. So that'll be something that we'll see as well. And that's why at the beginning I was saying you need to kind of know your own stuff about whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, because yes, it can be a slippery slope, but you need to know for yourself what your feelings are, because they'll come out in terms of your clients. I think also, like for people I know who are in recovery, like a good friend of mine had said um, he, he'd given up all of his drugs. And when people said, well, you could drink a little now. And he goes, no, I'm not the kind of guy who could just drink a little. If I start drinking, I'm going to be drinking like everything. So everybody's different. And this is my personal feeling. If people are in abstinence-based recovery and it's working, I would stay with that. And everybody's going to be different. Yeah, thanks. Somebody wrote privately, fentanyl is finding its way into all the drugs nowadays. It's very dangerous. And that's the danger of buying drugs on the street. Whereas if you went into a store, you wouldn't get fentanyl. I mean, doctors use fentanyl for during operations, but that's a whole different kind of thing. So again, we want to make sure about the danger. So again, I really thank everybody for, I think everybody for participating, and I hope this was helpful as a start. Seems to me like there could be a lot more information. More information will be coming out, and so kind of keep your antenna up for that. And as many of you know, I like to end before I give you the evaluations with hope. And it's many of the states, by the way, by July 1st, things will be open, at least in New York. And depending on where you are, thank you for coming wherever you're from. But again, hope is something we give to clients. And I hope that everybody has a good rest of the day. And I hope I see you again.